Yeah. All right. So, happy Employee Ownership Month, everyone. My name is Matt Cropp. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. We are Vermont's nonprofit clearinghouse for all things employee ownership. And we try to do this presentation at least once a year during Employee Ownership Month. It's just a chance for both folks in companies and communities in the broader community to get a general sense of the basics of what broad-based employee ownership is, and some of the kind of diversity of it as well, because it includes a number of different things that go beyond just uh, you know uh, perhaps the most common models you might be familiar with. So, to start with, yes, the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, our organization, we've been around since 2001. We're a nonprofit. We receive part of our funding from the state of Vermont, particularly around work on ownership succession. So folks who want to, exit ownership of their business and are thinking about employee ownership as a way to do that, right? And with a variety of impacts that are involved there. And we work out of a little office in Burlington. So when we talk about employee ownership, I'd like to start by kind of having a look back into a little bit of the, what we really mean when we say ownership generally, because this helps especially give context for some of the differences between the different kinds of employee ownership, because these things play out in different ways, right? But when you think about ownership of something, right, whether you're thinking of a car or a house or a business or um, you know, a shovel, right? There's really fundamentally two core claims that an owner has over the thing that they own, right? So there's control, the ability to make decisions about how to use it, who can use it, what is, if it can be lent out, rented out, etc. And then claim to the value of what is owned, right? If you sell it, the proceeds of that sale. If you rent it out, right, the rent, you're the one as the owner, the one who has claim to that, right? So there's the what can you do with it, and how do you realize value from it? And those two questions are things that we'll see kind of are answered in different ways by the different types of employee ownership. So when thinking about kind of what the scope of our work is and what we really focus on, right? There's a variety of ways that people can be a co-owner of a company. Uh, there's things that look more like equity compensation. There's things where maybe a few key employees or managers might have some ownership. The thing that we at the VEOC focus on is what we call broad-based employee ownership. And by that we mean forms of ownership that provide a path of co-ownership for all employees. So everyone who works at a business has the potential to benefit from ownership. This doesn't necessarily mean you go to work on day one and you're an owner, right? There's a lot of different ways to sort of bring people on. But at least if you go to work for one of these companies, you have a path to having that ownership stake in the company. And again, thinking about those two things, the control and the financial benefit, these things can be structured in a few different ways, right? So when we think about the financial return, the two most common and straightforward ways of thinking about how people who are the owners of the business obtain value, right, are capital gains, which are based on the value of the business as something as an asset, and then profit, the sharing of profit or surplus, right? So more as the what does the business generate in terms of its cash and revenue, and how is that shared? In some cases, the both of those things are at play, and in other cases, it might be primarily one or the other, as we'll see. The second piece is control, right? So if you have one owner, right, that owner, governance is very easy. That person has decision-making power and can control what is owned. When you have a larger group of people, that becomes, you need to have a more structured approach to it. And again, there's a huge diversity here, right? There's forms of governance where decisions are made in a fairly direct way, right? The employees directly own shares, they can vote those shares, right? They can run for the board of directors, et cetera. Or it can be something where it's indirect, and the rights, the governance rights, the decision-making rights are delegated to someone to act on behalf of the owners. And this can look like a trustee. It can look like things like proxy voting, where someone can simply assign their governance power to other people. again, lots of diverse ways of approaching this, and there's a few more as we get into a few of the most common models of employee ownership. And I will sort of stop for a moment just briefly to say, if there are questions as we go, feel free to put them to put them in the chat, and I'm happy to kind of get into any specifics as you're thinking about what it is that you particularly are interested in learning from this today. So before we get into the models, right, there's a little bit of the question of why, right? Why does our organization say we want to see more employee ownership in the world? And there's some pretty straightforward reasons, right? That it is beneficial for companies, individuals, and the communities in which companies operate. There's a lot of research done on employee ownership, and if you're curious to kind of look at the research directly, two great sources are, one is the National Center for Employee Ownership, or NCEO, has some good summaries of research about employee ownership. And then the Center for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers is probably the place that generates the most new information, where they have various postdoctorate fellows and others who study employee ownership and put out um, papers and things like that each year on it. So they're one of those ways that we can kind of deepen the knowledge of the impact of it. But practically speaking, what we see with employee-owned companies versus other kinds of companies is, on average, higher productivity, higher rates of profit, and higher rates of growth. And at its core, there's kind of two things to think about here. One is that if you just purely think about aligned incentives, right? So if someone owns something, they're generally going to take better care of it. They're going to pay attention to it in a different way than if they're using something someone else owns. And that's true of a company as well as a borrowed tool, right? Um, the but one of the key things is companies are complex, right? It's a lot different to think about owning a company than a shovel. Uh, and so when you kind of break down these numbers about the performance of employee-owned companies, it really kind of bifurcates into two buckets. One is companies that might have an employee ownership structure there, but don't really pay too much attention to it. They say, okay, it's just one of the benefits you learn about when you're onboarded. You get a statement once a year about your ownership stake, and all well and good. And then there are other companies for whom they really lean into having what is often referred to as an employee ownership culture. And that can be built in many ways, but particularly important is business literacy education and being able to effectively communicate financial performance and numbers to the employee owners. Because if you work somewhere and you theoretically have an ownership stake, but you don't really have line of sight to how your work impacts the overall bottom line and value of the thing that you co-own, there's a disconnect there. But if you have things like open book management or great game of business or other systems like that that are systematically improve people's understanding of the finances of the company and give them concrete goals around it, those are the companies where when combined with ownership compared to companies that do similar things but don't have ownership, that this performance bonus really kind of kicks in. So the bonus is marginal for companies that don't really embrace that broader culture building and education work, and they're really quite significant for those who do. From the perspective of communities and economic development, right, we have, companies tend to have lower turnover. People stick around longer, build careers at them in places they otherwise might not. They also, tend to have, lower rates of layoff, and in financial downturns. So there's kind of a stabilizing impact that a community has when they have more employee owners in employee-owned companies in the economic mix. So when thinking about just this broader world of employee ownership, there's many different ways to structure it, and there's plenty of companies that do kind of have basically rolled their own, right? Uh, Vermont has a great example of that in Chroma Technologies, which is, they basically have fees every year. Those employees directly hold and vote the stock and get dividends. And, when they leave, there's a formula to buy it back. So there's many different ways of doing it. But in general, there's certain templates that are the kind of the most common ways that people do employee ownership. And the three most common templates, that that the vast majority of the work that we do tends to be around are the three on your screen, right? The worker-owned cooperative, the employee stock ownership plan, and the employee ownership trust. Each have some unique elements to them that both recommend and don't recommend them in certain types of situations. Um, but it's it's a thing where oftentimes when folks are exploring becoming employee owned, it requires some conversation, really thinking not just about financial feasibility, although that's part of it, but also about the culture of the company, the scale of the company, et cetera. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go into what are these different kinds of employee ownership. So to start with, our worker cooperatives, and worker cooperatives are a subset of the broader type of business that are cooperatives. And cooperatives are defined by which stakeholder group owns them, right? In a traditional, um, you know, company that's traded on the stock market, right? The owners are the investors, the people who provide capital to the company. Cooperatives are defined by which, whether it's in worker co-ops, right? The employee group is the stakeholder that owns the company. And things like a credit union or a food co-op or housing co-op, it's the customers who buy from the company who are the co-owners. And then in things like, and very commonly in agriculture, it's sometimes the farmers who market their product through the company. So there's a bunch of differences between these different kinds of co-ops, but at the core, there's a few pieces that are common to them all that kind of make them cousins within this family of organization types. So with a worker cooperative, the someone goes to work for the company for a period of time. Usually, I'd say on average, when we last surveyed worker cooperatives in Vermont, of which there are about 20, it was probably about 1.5 to 2 years, where they just work as an employee, get to, and it's oftentimes referred to as the trial period, see if they're a good fit and all of that. If it turns out that they are, then the existing members or existing board of directors invite them to purchase a share of the co-op to become a co-owner. A key thing about this is that the share price is a fixed number. It's not connected to the market value of the company, but rather is this kind of balance of wanting a thing that someone would walk away from, but not so much barrier to, continued ownership succession and bringing new people in and building a strong culture of ownership in the company. And that share, right, gives, as we were talking about before, the both governance and financial rights. On the governance side, once you become an owner, that share gives you a vote for a board of directors. That board is in small companies, and we see this go down to maybe 4 employees. Occasionally, it can work for 3. So it's a viable structure for fairly small companies. But that board is responsible then for setting policies, overseeing management, approving an annual budget, kind of the high level decisions. And then usually there's a more of an operational general manager, CEO, who's responsible for overseeing the operational part of the business. So in a very small company, it just might be everyone is on the board, and once a quarter or once a month, take your employee hat on, put your board hat on, and have those kind of more high-level strategic conversations. In bigger companies, it's an elected group. So the other piece, of course, is financial. So one of the key things that allows for this model to be viable for much smaller companies, as we'll see in comparison to the ESOP model, which I'll talk about next, is that onboarding and offboarding people does not require doing a valuation of the company, right? And for a very small company, having to do things like valuations and other things like that add a lot of overhead to an ownership model. So if you have to, every time someone is an employee owner leaves or starts, you have to do a valuation. That's going to add a lot of friction. So essentially, the way that people in a worker co-op receive financial benefit is when there's profit, that profit is allocated amongst the members on the basis of the work that they contributed, either hours worked, so this is a more flat formula, or based on W-2 income, so the value of the labor they contributed. So higher earners, right, get a higher share of profit as well. Some of that might come in cash, and some of that might be paid out in might be sort of kept in the company as working capital. But when you leave, the company, you get your share back at face value, and then the company essentially will usually pay out what has been retained in your name over time in installments. And this is a common thing in many employee ownership models, so that it allows the company, if the company's constantly having to buy itself back, this repurchase obligation means that the sort of impact on cash flow can be managed by doing it in installments. And so this is, just from that decision-making perspective, this is just a quick graphic that again gives you the sense of the way that authority kind of and power flows in an organization, right? So you have those members who elect the board, oftentimes amongst themselves, although there might be outside board members. They then turn around and that board selects and oversees the general manager, and make sure that that general manager is running the company effectively, because that has a big financial impact on all those owners. And then that general manager then hires and supervises staff, including staff who are owners, right? And so there's an important educational piece in these kinds of companies, where you need to sort of in this, and be able to really communicate to folks, when is it that you are having your governance owner hat on, right, and having a conversation as peers who co-own this business together, and when is it important to have your employee operational hat on to say, like, it's great that I'm an owner, but I have a job description, and still need to do what I need to do to make sure that the company is running well. And so being able to sort of clearly document and communicate where and when certain types of decisions are made is very important, especially compared, again, to enterprises that are owned by one or just a handful of people, where a lot of that is just intuitive. So the second model here, right, is the employee stock ownership or plan or ESOP. This is by far the most common form of employee ownership in the U.S., with by far the most employee owners. It's been around for better part of actually more than 50 years now. It was originally um, created as part of a big overhaul of retirement law in an experimental way for maybe about 20. Why ESOPs have been as successful as they have is because they have some fairly significant tax advantages that incentivize the creation of employee ownership, and it's at this point a fairly mature model in terms of the professional support and other things like that. So the key thing to understand about the ESOP to begin with is that, whereas what we were talking about before is something where the employee owners directly own a share of stock, right? In the ESOP, and they directly put some cash into the business. With the ESOP, someone goes to work for the business and they start to build ownership as part of their compensation package. So there's never kind of a moment where the employees are required to start dip into their own savings account and to become owners, but rather gradually build up ownership through these contributions to a special retirement plan. So it's, the retirement plan is governed by the kind of same laws as things like 401ks and IRAs, and has the same tax treatment for individuals. So that, another kind of thing with this compared to others is that, that the company doesn't really need to worry about accidentally creating some sort of like unexpected tax burden for owners, because people will only pay the taxes when they start receiving their retirement income from their retirement accounts. So in the meantime, that simplifies things from an employee perspective pretty significantly. The flip side, of course, is that retirement plans are highly regulated and somewhat complicated, and so it adds a layer of complexity and cost on the company side. That cost can often be either offset, or very much more than offset, by the tax savings, because these ESOP companies that are organized as S corporations, it's a company, it's a pass-through entity, so that the company doesn't pay tax, it's the owner who pays the tax. And if the only owner is this tax-preferred retirement plan, then the company basically has no direct tax liability. Again, taxes will be paid eventually, like they'll pay taxes on 401k distributions, but it does mean that for companies that have a significant amount of profit, the tax savings can significantly, outweigh some of the overhead of some of the more, administrative costs. Another key thing about it being a retirement plan is the role of the trustee. So whereas again, those worker co-op members directly elect the board of directors, there's a special role of the plan trustee who has very clearly defined legal duties that are overseen by the U.S. Department of Labor as the fiduciary of a retirement plan to act in the financial best interest of the employee owners. And so that means, for the most part, the trustee is actually the one who will exert any of the governance voting power of the shares that are allocated to employees' accounts. There are a few exceptions to this. In certain cases, when a company is being sold, there might be a pass-through vote to the employee owners, and there's some ESOPs that add some higher levels of participation on the part of the employee owners. But the sort of default vanilla model has that trustee is a really kind of key sort of linchpin in terms of where the sort of control really sits within the ownership piece of the organization. And so one of the things that we see with, whereas I talked about with the co-ops, we'll see oftentimes very small businesses, 3, 4 employees who will be the ones to, as small enough to do it. And of course, they can get quite big as well, right? There's Cooperative Home Care Associates in New York City has 2,500 employees, so it's a scalable model for sure. But for ESOPs, there is a much more of a clear floor in terms of size that's a bit higher. So our rule of thumb tends to be at least 20 employees, at least $500,000 a year in profit as this kind of minimum scale. There's certain cases where smaller than that will work, but it's something where there's a bunch of technical reasons why you really need to kind of take a close look at it before saying, okay, yes, we definitely want to do this. Whereas above that scale, it's less of there's a much smaller question mark around whether this is a feasible thing to do. And so from the employee's perspective, right, they go to work, the company makes these pre-tax retirement plan contributions every year that go into their ESOP account, which are, their ESOP account accumulates shares. And there isn't sort of that sudden line going from employee to employee owner, but rather those employees are going to be vesting every year as on a vest in their ownership of the shares. And then when they leave, plus the retirement age, in which case it's accelerated, but the company has up to 5 years to start buying back the shares. And once it starts buying back the shares, it has 5 years to finish making that repurchase. And so again, that's a way of kind of spreading out the cost rather than having, big hit all at once. And it's something where it gives kind of a long-term perspective to the type of ownership. Whereas, in things where the value is more cash flow based, like the co-op, right? People are sort of seeing direct payments perhaps every year if the company's profitable and doing well. Whereas with the ESOP, they might see the value of those shares grow because the company does an annual valuation. So it's this capital gain rather than profit that's being shared in terms of the way that value is shared in the ESOP. And so when we're looking at companies and saying, all right, you're thinking about I think there's a couple of things. One thing is stable cash flow, right? If companies needs to make and not huge capital kind of requirements in the near future, because almost always an ESOP transition is going to be involve debt, and so if the company's already heavily leveraged, that can be a challenge because they just built a new facility or the company too, right? So the base is strong, right? There's good retention, good culture, and also there's an important consideration for employee ownership generally, and in ESOPs in particular because of the retirement thing, around workforce demographics age-wise, right? So if you look at the company and it's like strong financials, but hey, 2/3 of our workforce is, over the age of 60. So there's going to be how is the company going to manage that sudden massive turnover of talent, right? And plan for the repurchase obligation of buying back those shares in the future. So when people do kind of an initial feasibility study, right, there's of course looking at the valuation, looking at the business model and business environment, but there's also looking at that the workforce demographics is another key piece. Um, and then, thinking about what are the goals of the selling owner. One of the things about an ESOP is it can be done in pieces, right? So it doesn't have to go 100% all at once. So sometimes folks will use this as a model to say if there's two business partners and one's 10 years older than the other and wants to retire and the other one wants to stick around, using the ESOP to buy one partner share, pay that off, and then buy the second share when that second owner is ready to leave, right? So there's some flexibility there in terms of kind of using it as a tool to, take chips off the table on the part of the selling owners while creating an opportunity for the existing owners to build equity. And so, when I'm talking to business owners, yeah, that there's that scale piece, there's that financial piece, there's the demographics piece, and then there's a bit of the culture piece, right? And an interesting difference between the worker co-op and the ESOP is because the worker co-op requires those employees to really put their own money in, the employees are going to be really an active participant in the sale process. Usually there's a steering committee of employees who are going to, represent, do the research, represent the buy side of the transaction. In the case of the ESOP, it's actually, the selling owner's creating the buyer in a way, in that the buyer's kind of representative is going to be that trustee. And so, in many cases, the employee group doesn't actually know that the transaction is happening until it's happened. I've heard of kind of funny stories of, staff meeting being called and, the people being introduced to, oh, we're going to introduce you to the new owner. And then they, pull a tablecloth off a mirror and say, oh, it's you, right? Being a little silly about it. But, it goes to show how it can get to that point before the broad base of employees know. That's not always the case, and company culture will oftentimes dictate, is this something that, you're from a risk-averse lawyer perspective, you're going to avoid disclosing just in case something goes sideways and the transaction doesn't happen, versus, okay, we all talk about everything anyway. There's no way we can keep something this big from, an honest and open conversation. But because of this, the sort of cultural question is a little, the question of like, will the company culture support employee ownership is a little bit more critical on the worker co-op side, because that culture needs to support the actual transaction. Whereas with an ESOP, there are plenty of companies where they kind of look very conventional, and then over time, post-transaction, they kind of, it's always nicer to see that a lot of that work and open book management and other things present beforehand, but it's a little bit, it's a little bit less critical in that way. And then the final sort of template model of employee ownership is this idea of employee ownership trusts. This is actually the most common form of employee ownership in the United Kingdom, but it's only in the last decade or two really started to be picked up in the U.S. Employee ownership trusts are kind of part of a broader family of ownership called perpetual purpose trusts, which are, as it sounds like, trusts that can be set up to own an asset in perpetuity, right, forever, right? There's no end date to the trust, for a defined purpose. And it's a fairly flexible model in that way, and that defined purpose can be many different things. So, for instance, it could be something like the Patagonia was the high-profile example of this, where it was kind of the purpose that they wrote into the ownership was stewardship of the environmental mission. In the case of employee ownership trust, that purpose is generally defined as to benefit current and future employees of the company. And so, but that purpose can also be embedded with other purposes. And so this is a model that I probably see the most interest in from business owners for whom they have strong kind of mission and or legacy considerations, that they also want to have baked into the ownership of the company. So whereas let's say there's as an example, a company that has had a long, multi-generational family business, has had presence in a town for 120 years, and the next generation of kids don't want to take it over, so the current generation of owners are considering employee ownership as their exit. But maybe because of that long-standing commitment, they to the local town, they want to make sure that the store that's in the town is never going to be moved out of the town, right? Um, in the case of, the question is how, that sort of value on the part of the selling owners, how easy or difficult is that to lock in, right? With the case of the worker co-op, right, the control is in the hands of the employee owner. So if in 10 or 15 years they're like, we want to sell the building and move the store out to this other town, right? That's a decision on them, right? And there's not really a way that with them having direct control of the company, that you could bake that in. Similarly, with the ESOP, that fiduciary duty piece on the part of the trustee means that, if there's a really compelling financial reason for the company to sort of change course, because as the steward of the retirement savings of the employee owners, the trustee has actually a legal obligation to pursue that, right? Which kind of gives and that can probably the most common way that piece can play out is for questions of company independence. So someone might say, all right, well, if a strategic competitor comes in and says, hey, we're willing to buy you for 3 times the value of your last just kind of basic valuation of the company, that's life-changing money for folks, right? And the trustee really is kind of like not in a position to say, well, we also value the independence of the company, and so we're going to turn that down. If it's not as extreme, there can be cases of that, right? Or other factors can be taken into account. But at a certain dollar amount, it sort of tips into that, well, this is a deal that's really too good to pass up. So in both of those cases, right, they can be, things that are, ways of continuing a legacy, but the sort of the legal kind of level of intensity of that legal you know commitment is not super high. It's by far the sort of the strongest mechanism is this employee ownership trust, to sort of have seller priorities kind of baked into the ownership in the future. It's significantly cheaper to set up one of these than an ESOP, probably equivalent to or maybe a little more expensive than a worker co-op. Um, but it's and one of the key things, right, is that ultimately the ownership of the stock is actually in the trust itself. So unlike the ESOP, which allocates the stock into people's accounts, or the worker co-op, right, where folks hold those shares, the shares never leave the trusts. And so, the British refer to this as naked in, naked out. So when people don't bring any ownership to the table, and when they leave, they have no further claim. People is generally sort of a profit sharing mechanism, where bonuses or other such things, right? Probably the biggest example of one of these in the UK is a company called John Lewis Partnership, which was a department store chain that was founded in the 1920s, and is definitely seen as one of the pioneers of this model. And then the question of governance, again, it's a very flexible model. So it could be something that looks like, an ESOP with like just a trustee, professional trust company that oversees it. It could be something that looks like a worker co-op where it's only employees and they're elected by their peers to be trustees. And it could be something hybrid where, all right, maybe there's in a family business, there's always a seat set aside for one member of the family to have a say. Or, in some cases, if there's a mission or cause related element, have a seat set aside for a nonprofit whose responsibility is to oversee and make sure that the company is maintaining its commitment to that mission, after the departure of the selling owners. And so, this is one of those things where, there's less of a developed, set of practice and financial infrastructure around this in the U.S., but there's a lot of interest, and there's actually, one of the first conferences about it is happening in the U.S. is happening in February of this year. So there's some really interesting stuff afoot. So just to review, right? Thinking about these different types of employee ownership. On the controller governance side, right? With the worker co-op, you have one member, one vote basis of voting. There might be certain big issues where those employee owners, like say selling the company, it would be a direct vote rather than a decision of the board or something like that. the ESOP, right? It's the plan trustee who exercises that kind of the buck stops here, control over voting the shares. And with the employee ownership trust, it can be very flexible with multiple possible stakeholder groups and can be constrained by the priorities of the creator of that trust. When it comes to sharing value, right, with the worker co-op, it's the annual allocation of profit based on how much each person worked. There's no valuation or capital gains. It's purely sort of profit based. For the ESOP, it's the opposite, where there's not usually, although they legally can pay dividends. There's almost never kind of dividends or cash paid out to employee owners prior to leaving a retirement. So it's rather that kind of annual valuation shows how much the allocated stock has grown in value. And then when you retire or leave, it's cashed out again on sort of a predefined schedule. That's actually, there's a lot of legal guardrails around how that can be structured. And then with the employee ownership trust, usually it's just a profit share bonus type thing. In some cases, there can be things that do allow for a kind of a capital gain like exposure. So the use of things like synthetic equity, also sometimes referred to as phantom stock, that essentially are bonus programs, but that are connected to doing evaluation of the company. And so there's again, it's a very sort of flexible model there in terms of how exactly you structure kind of where the value from the company goes. And so finally, kind of getting into from defining these models, how does employee ownership come into being? So in some cases, it can come into being from the foundation of the company, right? The company starts with this kind of structure. This is not the case for ESOPs. ESOPs really, again, scale-wise, have to be of a certain scale and revenue before an ESOP makes sense. There, there are startup worker co-ops, and there's some models too around kind of creating, especially for companies with sweat equity, that require sweat equity to really get off the ground, allocate that sweat equity to folks, right? But the core trying to get the business off the ground, have a stake, and be in a position to really sort of put their shoulder to the wheel as it goes. For the most part, we see employee ownership coming into being, and this is the lion's share of our work, as an ownership succession strategy, right? So, it's a way of kind of on the owner's timeline usually, right, versus kind of the timeline of an outside buyer, sort of setting up a path to exiting, creating a market for the owner's shares, taking those chips off the table, right? It can, but it's not something that's always a retirement thing. It can also be something where, a mid-career owner decides they want to stay with the company for another 10 or 20 years, but they don't want to be in that sole owner role anymore. And so, they're going to be, that leadership transition is going to be way down the line, but they'll be maybe even on both the buy and the sell side of the transaction, deciding that they're going to continue to be the general manager or CEO type role for a period of time. Right? It's something that a lot of folks there's a mix of motivations for people who will pursue this, right? There's the financial piece, right? Sometimes it's going to be a competitive or, even maybe the best option for sale of a business because there's not, especially for small businesses, there's not a giant liquid market like the stock market that you can just go and be like, oh, I don't own this anymore. Easily sell it off, right? And so sometimes kind of cultivating an internal sale like this is the way that you're going to really find the buyers who understand the company in a way that other folks might not, and therefore don't have interest. A lot of folks also are motivated by both kind of the relationship they have to their employees and the sort of legacy and community and values they have embedded in the company. That's my example previously. There's a pretty big thread of the sort of family business with the employee group as the sort of next best option for the the stewardship of the legacy of the family business should the next generation not be interested. Similarly, for other sort of values related reasons, people will seriously pursue this. And it's something where that question for folks of what is it that I'm going to how does this connect to that relationship with the employees who help me build the business? And so that being having the employee ownership exit be something that is as part of their own personal legacy of having kind of passed this on and provided some significant real reward to those people. Um, and I think when people are starting to explore this, usually the first step is to have kind of some initial exploratory research and get a valuation. And that valuation, which can be useful for a number of different directions for for ending ownership, is a good kind of gut check for a business owner to say, okay, am I ready to do this now? Do I need to work on the business more before I'm ready to exit? And it can be then the basis for exploring the feasibility of both financial particularly, but also thinking about timeline and the role of the business owner after the transition, as a for starting to assess whether this is a reasonable path to pursue, and if so, what are the next steps to go down that path in terms of whether it's on the co-op side, engaging the employee group, whether it's on the ESOP side, um, sort of starting getting a pre-feasibility study with a professional firm, that sort of thing. So there's really kind of it's a model that can work quite well, but is also something that there's a number of pieces of work you want to go through to screen, look for red flags or yellow flags. And sometimes it's oh, this might not work now, but if these things change, then, and as you work on the business, it could be a viable option, and, in a year or two or something like that. So, I will say, again, one of our roles here and why we do this little presentation every Employee Ownership Month is to make sure that folks have access to all of the information about this. One of the things that we do every year is host an annual conference, which this coming year will be June 12th, that has a track specifically for selling business owners, that has multiple tracks for folks from employee-owned companies to talk to each other, to learn, about some of the specifics of information sharing, building an ownership culture, all of those things that really kind of are the secret sauce to employee ownership, and to sort of create space for conversation between the employee ownership curious folks and the folks who are doing it every day, which can be a really sort of fruitful opportunity. So always encourage folks to, if you're interested in this, either as an employee owner or as a owner of a business who's considering employee ownership, this is a great our kind of marquee event every year. But also, we exist to be an educational resource. We're, a 501c3 nonprofit. And so, if you have questions, either, again, as a member, as a, employee owner in an existing employee owned company, or as a community member or business owner who's, considering this, and sometimes we hear from folks who are employees who are thinking about a more of an employee driven thing, or but a lot of times we hear from business owners. We're always happy to kind of schedule a conversation or answer questions by email to make sure that you have access to the necessary information to really be successful, whether it's in making employee ownership work at your company, or uh, looking into, and seriously. So that's the end of my little slide deck dog and pony show. Feel free to throw any final questions in the chat, or if you would like to have a follow-up conversation, feel free to shoot an email to matt@veoc.org. So thank you very much, and many happy returns in Employee Ownership Month.